Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to be welcoming back Clinton Heylin. He's a returning guest. Last year, his episode was one of the most downloaded of the entire year. He's perhaps the world's authority on all things Dylan. He's a prolific writer, a trained historian in music and popular culture, and he's the author of several books, including this recent, which in the US it's going to be coming out very soon. This is volume one, The Double Life of Bob Dylan from 1941 to 1966. So I'm very honored to have back again Clinton Heylin. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, no problem, Paul. Yeah, happy.
So there's a lot of things in this book. It's a wealth of information, and I'm very glad you wrote the book. But what would you say has always been the purpose of the writing you create?
Um, to document the life and times in which we live and the popular culture in which we live in real time. I mean, I think people perhaps don't realize how lucky we've been in the last 40 or 50 years. I mean, I think in the future it will be looked upon as a golden age in popular culture, and it's very exciting to live in it and to experience these things in real time. I mean, obviously, one of the things that happened last year during the pandemic was a new Bob Dylan album of original songs. I mean, at the age of 79 and a half, a real privilege to be alive in this time and to hear that fresh and new the day that it came out, so yeah, I just like any good historian, I want to cover the period that fascinates me. It just so happens that that happens to be in real time.
Now, the last time we spoke, you were talking about these Bob Dylan archives, the Bob Dylan archives, I should say, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and you had made a few trips out. And I remember the word you used. You said extraordinary, these archives. And a lot of the information that was unearthed there, you present in this book. And so I'm hoping you can tell us about these archives and this experience of yours.
Well, obviously, I mean, when the press story, the original press story in the New York Times in 2016 broke about the acquisition by the George Kaiser Foundation of Bob Dylan's personal archive for $22 million, we were all kind of salivating at the thought of it, but also wondering what archive. I mean, Dylan's never really struck me as somebody who keeps everything. In fact, he never really struck me as somebody who kept anything, that he was always moving on. So I was obviously intrigued. When I finally visited for the first time in 2018, I think, I was stunned at the sheer size and depth of the archive. I mean, written material, audio material, video material, drafts of songs, a dozen different drafts of a major song, rehearsals, sound checks, you name it. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of hours of music. As I say, video footage that nobody knew existed, going all the way back. A photo archive. I mean, I would struggle to think of an archive of an individual of similar stature that comes close. I mean, obviously the Folger Library in Washington, which covers Shakespeare and all of the great Jacobean playwrights, is a vast resource, but none of it is contemporary and none of it is primary. In other words, it's books about that period. It's research about that period. This is real primary material. And I realized pretty quickly that everything that I'd been working on, everything that I'd been working towards needed to be rethought. And this book is the first of 2 volumes that aims to be that attempt to do my work with that as a backdrop, with this vast archive as a resource. Yeah.
So through these trips that you took out there to Tulsa, I'm sure, as you were mentioning, audio, video, items, was there something in particular, or maybe a few things that you really, really were enamored with?
I mean, obviously, for me, the manuscript material is the key material. It is fascinating to hear studio tapes, to hear rehearsal tapes, but if I can put it like this, they're more of the same. I mean, in other words, we've heard rehearsal tapes, we've heard studio tapes, we haven't heard this amount, but but with the manuscripts, particularly, the archive doesn't really start until Dylan's motorcycle accident in 1966. So, in terms of the manuscripts, from then on, though, are fulsome. And so there are entire periods we didn't know documented, So there was an album, a various artists album called Lost on the River, which purported to be the Lost Basement tapes. It wasn't, but what it was songs that had been written using Bob Dylan lyrics from after the motorcycle accident, but before the Big Pink sessions, so 1966 to 67. Songs that none of us knew about, an entire 24 songs that nobody knew existed. To see those things, it's very exciting. But, I mean, obviously the new volume, the first volume of My Double Life, doesn't draw so much upon the manuscript material because, as I say, it doesn't really kick in until after the accident. This volume, what I've been able to draw on is all of the footage for Don't Look Back and Eat the Document, the 2 films that Dylan made in 1965 and 66 when touring England. All of the outtake footage is there, and you see Dylan as you never see him, in downtime, off the clock, riffing, laughing with his mates, putting people on, but in very controlled environments, and you see the sharpness, you see the mind whirring round, and as I say, there was hours and hours of this, and you'll never see anything like that ever again. It's surprisingly unguarded. There are tapes of him talking with his friends in Minnesota in the early 60s when he was not a famous person. And again, you get a sense of the unguarded Bob Dylan. So that is important material for this volume, that you see a side of Dylan you never saw.
Interesting. Something that I got again and again by reading the book, and you used quotes and you used different pieces of information to again and again show this will on his part. I got that this will, this drive. You really did a great job of showing that this was a person who was very much committed to becoming an artist, to becoming a very successful one.
Becoming famous.
Right, famous. That's the word.
I think that in the early days, I don't think Dylan would have had the self-awareness, I don't think any of us do, to know, at 19 or 20, what it meant to be an artist. A performer, yes, but an artist. But that came. But the idea, obviously, initially is that he wants to be famous. And what's certainly, I hope, comes through in the book is exactly that, the drive to be famous. Because he's certainly given the impression over the years that it was something that just happened to him. He was walking down the road one day and he was, famous. And nothing could be further from the truth. And in fact, one of the sadder aspects of the book is relating some of the correspondence from Susie Rotolo, his long-term girlfriend in that period, to her best friend, describing her uneasiness with the way that Bob is not only becoming famous, but allowing it to happen to him, and how disturbed she is by the process and the people around him and what is happening to him as a result, and the distance that it created between the two of them. And there is a sense of inevitability about it, which is also sad.
The other thing that I thought was fascinating was how you were able to narrate and show this creation of the Bob Dylan as we know it from that time period. You know, from the inspiration he took from different people's vocal style, the different things that he glommed, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's something that I've developed over the years. I mean, that sense of where all the pieces come from. And I think, I would certainly suggest that when I started on this journey 30 years ago with the first edition of Behind the Shades, that I really did not have that ability to put that jigsaw together. I consider myself well informed about popular music, but the pieces are taken from so many disparate sources. And one of the things that I touch on in this, in the new book, is really the importance of the literary influences early on, particularly specifically the beats. We all knew that he had a fascination with the beats, but I don't think we realized, A, how early that was and how important that was. And in fact, when I talk about his time in Minneapolis, new papers have emerged, not from Tulsa, from auction houses, of his early attempts at poetry, which show that it was no fait accompli that he would become a folk singer, that he had ambitions to be a poet before he really had any sense of himself as a folk singer. And of course, ultimately, he learnt how to blend the two, but that took time. That took that took him the experience of living in New York and being around very literate, very well-read people.
Is there an author in literature that you think could be compared to Bob Dylan?
Well, the closest comparison to Dylan would be Shakespeare. I've said this before, and needless to say, one gets slightly vilified because the two worlds of Dylan scholarship and Shakespearean scholarship are so far apart. I actually make a comment in the introduction that Dylan scholars are usually referred to as obsessives, whereas Shakespeare obsessives are referred to as scholars. I would love to know what the distinction is. They're two extremely important literary artists. I actually was invited to do a lecture in the Einstein Forum in Potsdam in 2012. And the subject of the conference was, does Bob Dylan deserve to be the Nobel, to win the Nobel Prize for Literature? And obviously this was 6 years before he did win it. And the paper that I did was actually about a comparison between Dylan and Shakespeare. And essentially my argument was that if Shakespeare was alive today, he wouldn't have won the Nobel Prize for Literature because he existed in an oral culture. He existed in an era when the word was spoken. It was not written down. None of Shakespeare's words were written down with his permission in his lifetime. And in a way, Dylan's very similar in that sense, because there's no sense that he wants his words to be seen on the page. He wants his words to be heard. And he is very much an oral poet. There are other huge similarities between the two. Both of them, their profound love for money and the way that they produce their work for pay, and their desire to be popular and to appeal to a complete demographic, not merely those who'd gone to Oxford or Cambridge, but to people across the entire spectrum, literate, semi-literate, and illiterate. So I'd probably, he's the closest comparison I think you could make.
And what about musical artists? Who could you compare to Bob Dylan?
It's very hard. I mean, I think you have to go outside the spectrum that Dylan himself works in. I mean, you can make a legitimate comparison with somebody maybe like Miles Davis, somebody who has completely and totally transformed their genre and made it their own. I mean, Bob Marley, maybe, somebody who's made it that it lies at the center of what they do, and that nobody really thinks of anyone as being their equal. They have their contemporaries, but I'm not sure they have their peers. And I think Dylan is, to be honest, so head and shoulders above his fellow singer-songwriters. I think I've often said that if Dylan had started making music in 1975, i.e. started with the album Desire, he would still be by far the greatest singer-songwriter of his era. And I've just taken out most of what most people would consider his top 8-9 albums by that comparison.
The last time we spoke, I remember you said, and since this deals with the 20th century, 1941 to 1966, I remember you saying the Bob Dylan of the 21st century is remarkably different than the Bob Dylan of the 20th century. In what way would you say he is the most different from this era to what he has become now?
Well, of course, I leave you hanging at the end of this book. I'm sorry to say. We end with the motorcycle accident.
Right.
So the book really only covers 5 years of Dylan's creative life. And in fact, when I finished the book, and this was completely accidental, I'd forgotten that the motorcycle accident actually happened on the 5th anniversary of his most important early concert in New York, which was at the Riverside Church. Now, the book actually starts with his performance at Riverside Church because that's his first radio broadcast. It's the first time he gets written up in the New York Times. It's the night that he meets Susie Rotolo. It's a hugely important day in his life. So I start the book there. But when I started it there, I'd forgotten that 5 years later to the day, he falls off his motorcycle. And so this is a very cogent book. It's about a person who is growing, but there's no sense that at any point that he's shedding skins, if I can put it in those terms. After this book, when we get into the next part of the story, and it's a big story, I cover 5 years of his creative life in the first volume and 55 in the second volume. We see that person start to separate out. We start to see the personas become the personae, become a series of personalities. And obviously the great break after the accident, the great break is his conversion to Christianity in 1979. But from that point forward, I think he becomes a very, very different person. And I think also that he starts to struggle to connect himself to that person that I write about today. It would be interesting, not that he's going to do it, but it would be interesting for him to look at who that person was and discuss whether it's somebody he can relate to anymore. I don't think he can. That's my personal view.
This is more or less, I guess, a question about process, because as we've been discussing all of these different sources of information, there's interviews he's done through the years, there's the archive in Tulsa. How in the world did you take all of these facts? It must have been an organizational, real challenge to get all of this information. Was this a very difficult book to write?
Actually, to be honest, it was a surprisingly easy book to write because I'm bringing together so many strands that have been buzzing around in my head for years, and I've not been able to connect up because the information wasn't there. You know, to finally be able to listen to all the session tapes, to hear what was going on. I don't mean the takes of the songs. I'm talking about what was happening between the takes. You know, to hear that, to finally understand the relationships that Dylan had with his producers, with John Hammond, with Tom Wilson, with Bob Johnston, you know, it answered so many questions for me. And so, yeah, I have that kind of mind that can fairly easily, readily grab a date or a, you know, or organize things, you know, connect the dots. And so I don't have to, you know, constantly be flicking backwards and forwards between Wikipedia and you know, Dylan Day by Day. You know, I can pretty much recall that stuff. So, so actually, I found it surprisingly easy, and pulling it together was exhilarating. You know, because I had all this great stuff. I had all this great material that no one knew. You know, you know, if I don't know it, there's not many people that know it. You know, at this point, and so if I'm excited, I hope my readers will be excited. You know, it'll be a different challenge for the second volume because, as I say, that's a much more complex story.
A lot of biographical work, I think, it's something that I don't like about some of it is they have a tendency to, some authors, to deify the subject. And what I appreciate about this book is you don't do that. You very much present flaws, strengths, everything all together. Can you talk a little bit about that, your pursuit of the truth?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's hugely important. And as I say in the introduction, you know, Dylan had his own chance. He wrote Chronicles. It's, as I'd suggest, a liar's autobiography. There's almost nothing in it you can trust. So he had his chance. You know, if he doesn't want to tell us what really happened, I guess somebody else will have to do it. I wasn't there. You know, I can only piece it together. But at least I'm doing it with a degree of historic integrity. I was, you know, I'd like to feel that that's what I'm doing. But what I don't do is judge. I hope I don't. You know, I'm not moralizing. You know, it's far too easy, and particularly in today's cancel culture, you know, to apply the so-called perceived superior morality of contemporary times to something 60 years ago. And I don't like it. I mean, judging Christopher Columbus as guilty of race crimes, which has no concept in, you know, in the 15th century. I mean, you know, we're living in this world where judgment and morality is imposed on a fixed basis. And I step back from that. You know, I don't, of course, Bob did things that we could disapprove of when he was 22. But before we do that, we need to think back to when we were 22. Mm-hmm. you know, sleeping around, taking drugs. Does it sound familiar to you? Sounds familiar to me, you know. Right. And I think we have to be very wary about that. And we have to also recognize the pressures. You know, somebody said, you know, I mean, you know, the Beatles wanted to be famous, and they were famous, but nobody, I don't think, you know, except maybe Mark Chapman, is wandering around thinking that somebody is the Messiah. Dylan had to live with people who thought he had the answer, and obviously we reached that point at the end of this volume. You know, the 1966 Electric World Tour is that collision, and it is an explosive collision. And as with any explosion, you know, everybody gets burned, including Bob. And, there definitely is a question mark about whether he would have survived if he'd not been plucked out of that epicenter of the storm. Yeah.
And thanks for your comments on cancel culture. If we were to cancel everyone who has aired, everyone would be canceled.
Well, yeah. Let him who is without sin cast the first stone.
Precisely.
That's 2,000 years old. We should all be wearing that, on our T-shirts.
You brought up Chronicles, and you quote Chronicles a few times in the book, but you point out sometimes where it turns out, oh, this is more fiction than nonfiction. Why do you think he wrote the book?
That's a very good question. Obviously, the very first line of the book is me quoting something that Dylan said on a radio show in April 1963. Now, he's talking about writing his autobiography. And you go, well, okay, so he started thinking about writing his autobiography when he's young. You need to kind of rewind and think about it. In April 1963, Bob Dylan had sold less than 5,000 records in his entirety. He was completely and totally unknown in any meaningful sense. And yet, he's already thinking, he has that sense of destiny to be saying to himself, this is important. I need to write about this. And I think that ambition stayed with him, fleeting sometimes. He'd start writing it and then 2 weeks later be distracted by something else. And that was always the problem in his life. It was always pulled in other directions. What is curious, what is fascinating about Chronicles, and I only touch upon it in this volume, obviously I will get into it in the second volume, is that at some point in the process, he decided to create a false narrative. And it was at some point that was very close to the delivery of the book. In other words, he started with what seems to me honest intentions. And at some point decided, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to create this false narrative. It's, if you know the Orson Welles film F for Fake, it's like it's like a published version of that. He's having a joke at our expense because F for Fake is meant, it tells you up front, Orson Welles tells you he's going to lie to you, and Bob does. There are plenty of clues in Chronicles to tell you, don't believe a word. He doesn't write those kind of books. He's not, I can't remember who was the guy that wrote the Howard Hughes fake biography. Irving, is that Clifford Irving? Was that his name?
I think Clifford something, yes.
Yeah. He's not doing that. He's not trying to pass it off. He's not trying to, he just wants to see if you're going to be able to tell when he's saying something that you can believe and when he's not. And I quote in the book a conversation he has in 1966 at the Whiskey A Go-Go with Earl Leaf, who wrote for a magazine called Teen Set. And Dylan says to him, if I told you 10 things, one of which was true and 9 of which were bullshit, would you know which one was true? And Earl Leaf says, yeah, I would. And Dylan goes, okay, And, it's a brilliant exchange. And I only recently discovered it. And they're talking about the press conferences. They're talking about the press conferences Dylan was given at the time, which are a stream of put-ons.
Yeah.
And he's making the point that I put them on because they can be put on. If they asked honest questions, they would get an honest answer. If they asked me, do I do this for money? They're not going to get anything other than sent up. And so you have to see that side of the personality to understand anything. And Chronicles has to be treated in that and in those lines. In other words, as a work of literature, it absolutely has merits. As a work of chronicling, as the name implies, it's not. It's as unchronicle-like as a chronicle can be. Yeah.
Well, always entertaining, even when not factual.
Yeah, absolutely. And usually, at his most entertaining when he's at his least factual. I mean, he in that Scorsese film, he quotes the Oscar Wilde line, which actually I quoted some years before he did, about, if a man wears a mask, he tells the truth. It's interesting that he picked up on that.
Well, you brought up the film, No Direction Home. What did you think of that as a resource?
Well, obviously, I've drawn on it. I mean, the interviews that were done for that film were very important. I mean, the original intention was to do something that was more like the Beatles anthology, the TV series that the Beatles did to accompany the first anthology release. So, a 8-part telling of Dylan's story. So when Scorsese took over the project and turned it into this one-off story of the rise of Bob Dylan, if you like, and of course the span of No Direction Home, the film, is identical to the span of my book. So obviously I'm drawing on it, but I draw on it really to show again where Dylan wants to manipulate the truth and where he wants to point you in the right direction. I mean, the problem obviously with a film like that is that the people that you interview for it are the people who've been interviewed a million times. They're not the ones that have got the alternate version of the history, and you need both. I mean, one of the people not interviewed in there and who's no longer with us, sadly, is Tony Glover from Minneapolis, who would have been an absolutely essential interviewee for any telling of the real Dylan story, because he here is a guy who was there, who knew the unknown Bob Dylan, who knew him when he went around stealing his friends' records, and also knew the iconoclast. Was at Newport in 1965, was at the Highway 61 sessions. So what's missing from that film is people like that.
What role do you think Bob Dylan's management has had in his success in these times?
When you say his management, do you mean his original manager, Albert Grossman, or do you mean management across the board?
How about a bit of both?
I mean, Albert Grossman is obviously hugely important to the rise of Bob Dylan and the success of Bob Dylan. And one of the things that I do in the new book is cut him some slack. I mean, by which I mean, I certainly don't spare him in terms of the financial shenanigans that he got up to. There's no question that he lined his own pocket and that he did things that today would be illegal. I mean, he would actually go to jail for. Then grey area, some of them, but morally not grey. I mean, some of the things he, taking money for Dylan's publishing from both Dylan, his client, and the music publisher without telling Dylan that's what he's doing. That's pretty shameful. But in terms of his interest in Dylan's career and his passion and determination to make him a star, I don't think anyone could have been a better choice. And I think that even Dylan recognized that. So I go into that in much more detail. I mean, certainly one of the key points in the new book is the point at which Dylan is convinced by his then producer, John Hammond, to sign a piece of paper which reneges on a legal document that his manager had sent to pull out of the contract that he had with Columbia Records. Now, the contract that he signed in 1961 was a slave contract. And John Hammond knew what he was doing, and he didn't give a damn. And he sold Dylan down the river. And Dylan was too young, too naive, and too desperate to get on the record label to query it. A year later, when he had a proper manager, his manager told him to sign a piece of paper that said, we're pulling out of this contract because it was signed when Dylan was a minor, which it was. And therefore it has no legal validity. Columbia are dead in the water. Hammond then pulls a fast one. He calls Dylan into his office without legal representation and gets him to sign a piece of paper that reneges on the reneging. Now, Grossman still was in a strong position because the contract that they got him to sign was for 5 years, and legally it could only be for 3. And he was promised all sorts of things by Columbia that before, they would re-sign Dylan. They came through on none of them. And Grossman fought them tooth and nail. And in 1966, 4 years later, he's still arguing with them. Where's the contract? Where's the royalty bump? And Dylan has let the thing slide. And as you'll see in volume 2, I'm afraid I'll give you the spoiler. As you'll see in volume 2, he rues the day because everything that he did in that afternoon in 1962 will come back to haunt him in 1967. And Columbia will do the dirty on him to force him to re-sign with them. Grossman by that point is pretty much out of the picture. But Grossman tried to stand by him and did his best. Dylan, of course, like all the artists from the 60s, learnt the hard way. They all got ripped off. Beatles got ripped off. Stones got ripped off. The Who got ripped off. I mean, I could go through the list. I mean, obviously, I've written books about it. So Dylan was no different in that sense. The difference is that Dylan was smart and Dylan learnt the hard way, but he learned and he never made that mistake again. He also never had a manager again. I know I refer to Jeff Rosen as Bob's manager. I think even Jeff would balk at that. He doesn't see himself as Bob's manager, I don't think. And I don't think Naomi Saltzman, who was his lawyer for many, many years, she was his lawyer. They're as close to a manager, both Jeff and Naomi, as Dylan has had since Grossman. But he's never really had a manager because he's decided he can do without. So, of course, the downside of that is that there's nobody around to tell him, that's a dumb idea, Bob.
Have you found his management to be cordial in terms of the work that you do writing these books?
Jeff Rosen has been enormously helpful. I couldn't have written this book without the cooperation of the office, the Dylan office, and without Jeff's cooperation. Absolutely not. Is it plain sailing? Do they let me do what I want? No, of course not. At the end of the day, they work for Bob Dylan. And I'm sure that Dylan makes it very plain where the line is and what is acceptable to let slide and what isn't. But having dealt with a lot of management companies over the years, the one thing that is enjoyable about dealing with the Dylan people is that they're reasonable. There's none of that sense that, hey, we can do what we like. We can squash you if you annoy us, and that certainly is the case with others. And indeed, at least one other very famous singer-songwriter did set out to systematically squash me legally and failed. So I've had both extremes in my working life.
You've seen Bob Dylan in concert it's about 150 times. Is that correct?
Yeah, just under that. Yeah.
Okay. Is there one of those concerts that, in your mind, is particularly memorable? Maybe an exceptional show that you saw?
Well, the one that I tend to talk about, just because it seems um, counterintuitive that it should be such a great epiphany because of when it happened, is Dylan's concert in Prague in 1995. So, now, most people who are interested in Dylan but do not consider themselves hardcore Dylan fans would not think that Dylan's greatest ever concert was in 1995. How would you compare that with 1966, 1979, 1975, the great years of Dylan tours? But the truth of the matter is that the very first concert he gave in 1995 on the Neverending Tour in Prague, to many, many Dylan fans, and I was there, was one of the most extraordinary concerts I've ever seen by anybody. And I would put his acoustic set that night alongside any 1966 show. It's that good. And the fact that he could do it when he was 54 years old, and be that person and be in that space is an extraordinary testimony to him as an artist. And I've copied that tape from many people over the years, a lot of musicians, a lot of well-known musicians, because they always are surprised when I say that. I said, this is as good as it got. And they're like, 1995? Surely not. But there are other shows. I mean, I was at Farm Aid, the first Farm Aid in 1985 in Champaign, Illinois, and that was absolutely extraordinary. First time we played with the Heartbreakers, really incredible show. But yeah, and obviously many other great shows. But yeah, Prague is the one I go back to. Yeah.
Of the studio albums, what would you say is Dylan's absolute masterpiece in your opinion?
I get asked that a lot. I mean, and it's a very boring answer. Blown the Tracks. It's not. Yeah. I mean, obviously, I just recently wrote a long monograph about Blown the Tracks when the big box set came out, and yeah, I mean, that's the one that everyone seems to pick. But I'm sorry, it is a work that stands alongside any great. I mean, I've compared it with Shakespeare's sonnets in print. And I think that's where I would put it.
The last time we talked, something that stuck out in my mind, I remember you saying that you saw Tony Bennett when you were 12 years old. And yeah. I'm very interested. Your parents exposing you to music like Sinatra, like Tony Bennett, these great classic singers. Do you think that had an effect on you and the work that you do today?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, my mother, who sadly passed away very recently and to whom the book is co-dedicated, I said to her shortly before she died, I said, what's really strange is that my parents had the most appalling taste in music to me, because they came from a generation and a bit. I said, but now looking back, the fact that my mother primarily took me to see not merely Tony Bennett, but Dionne Warwick, Diana Ross, Nana Mouskouri, if anybody knows Nana Mouskouri these days, Petula Clark, all these what I would consider middle of the road singers, but also great singers. I mean, Dionne Warwick actually is one of my all-time favorite singers these days. But at the time that I was dragged along to see her, I'm like, who the hell is, So I'm very grateful that they took me to see those people, the people I would not have consciously chosen to go and see. And one of the things that happened, we were talking earlier about the golden age of popular culture. And if you think about it, the fact that I could go and see Tony Bennett one night and then 2 nights later see David Bowie doing Ziggy Stardust shows, which I did, not with my parents, needless to say. The fact that I could do that is something extraordinary. It really was an exciting time. I know it's slightly off picture, but I remember telling people, I went to see The Who were playing in Manchester. This is in 1973 when I was 13. And I saw the show and they debuted their new album. And it was the first ever performance of the album. First show they ever did. And they played the whole of Quadrophenia. I was like, that was good. I enjoyed that. Next night, at a different venue in Manchester, there was a guy called Neil Young. And he debuted Tonight's the Night, that night in Manchester. The night after The Who debuted Quadrophenia.
How about that?
I mean, you can't imagine that. At the time, you like it because it's good, but you don't think this is world changing. Can you imagine 2 albums that good coming out in 2021? Sadly, I can't. So yeah, I definitely feel a certain simple twist of fate was involved. And I was named after a singer. I was named after Clinton Ford, who was a known English pop rock singer in the late 50s and was from Manchester, where I'm from. But I didn't know that at the time. I didn't know that that's who I was named after. But yeah, so yeah, there was something in the air.
Interesting. Can you remember your initial emotional, your initial intellectual reactions when you were exposed to Dylan for the first time?
Well, it's a very odd story. I think I have told it, but essentially, I'd heard a few of the sort of greatest hits. I probably borrowed a greatest hits from somebody at school, but it didn't register with me. And I read an article. Again, I was 12 years old, about bootlegs. It was an article about bootlegs, about, as it happened, Bob Dylan bootlegs, by Michael Gray, and he starts writing about this event, the Royal Albert Hall, which we now know was not the Royal Albert Hall, it was the Free Trade Hall in Manchester. But and he tells the story about the Judas, and I'm like, I've got to hear this. I've got to hear this. So I asked around at school, and somebody told me about a shop that sold these things called bootlegs, and I went down there, and I was like, "Do you have this?" And I show them the article, and they go, "We sold out." They said, "We'll be getting some more in, but we haven't got it at the moment." So I'm like, oh. So I go to the back of the shop and I start leafing through, and I saw a copy of a Bob Dylan album called Talking Bear Mountain Picnic Massacre Blues. And for whatever reason, I loved the title, and I was like, that's funny. And I think maybe even I might have read the lyrics at some point. So I bought the album and I took it home, and I had no idea what it was. And of course, it's all Dylan doing old blues songs. He's 20 years old. It's all early freewheeling outtakes. And, he's doing Hollywood songs and, Own Me Wise, Murder Ballad, and stuff like that. And I'd never heard anything like it. I hadn't heard the blues at that point. I didn't know that it was like not normally sung by well brought up middle class kids from Minnesota. That wasn't usually your kind of blues auteur. But it blew my mind, definitely. And I still have that record. I still have that copy of that record, and I still love that record.
Well, as the book is coming out here in the U.S. in just May 18th, correct?
May 18th, yeah.
May 18th, coinciding pretty much with Bob Dylan's 80th birthday, May 24th. The other day, I was listening to different interpretations that other singers have done of Bob Dylan, like Brian Ferry, Garth Brooks. I was just going right down the list and comparing. And I'm very curious to get your perspective on this. Who do you think has done the best at covering Bob Dylan?
Well, somebody was asking me about this recently, and I think they got slightly taken aback when I said there are only 2 versions of Bob Dylan songs that are better than Bob Dylan's. In my opinion. of all the ones I've ever heard, that I can always think of a better Dylan version. And the only two exceptions are Van Morrison, Them, It's All Over Now, Baby Blue, which is, Dylan's done many great versions of Baby Blue, but the best one is the one on the second Them album with Van Morrison. I mean, which is just an absolute masterpiece. And the other one is Television, Knocking on Heaven's Door, the version of Knocking on Heaven's Door that they used to do in 1978, which is just an epic masterpiece. And again, I love Dylan's version, but that probably gives the game away. That's a pretty exacting standard. Everyone else, even those who've done great Dylan versions of Dylan songs, I'll take Dylan's any day. And they're just not in the spirit. I mean, there's many. The Byrds' Tambourine Man, if you took it in isolation, is a wonderful pop song. It's an atrocity. It's an absolute bastardization of the song. It destroys the meaning of the song completely in order to turn it into a pop song. It's an insult to the song. How ironic that it should also be the first number one of a Dylan song. I think even Blowing in the Wind, I don't think made it to number one. But if it lets people into Dylan's world, I mean, I think that's the greatest legacy you can have. There must be somebody out there who heard Adele do that truly poor song from Time Out of Mind, To Make You Feel My Love, and thought, I wonder who that guy is. And if so, that's a great thing. I'd be disappointed if they thought that's the best he can do. But, if it leads them to Dylan, so much the better.
As a writer, how important is it to you when you come out with a book like this and it's reviewed? Do the reviews matter to you?
That's a great question. I wish I got asked that more often. This is going to sound terrible. The reviews only matter for the same reason that I just gave about cover versions. If they bring people's attention to the fact that the book exists. I mean, I have no interest in what the reviewer has to say. There is no chance whatsoever of a reviewer thinking of something that I haven't already thought of and dismissed. Because even if it was just a new book, I would have been thinking about it for 2 years. As it happens, this is a book I've been thinking about for 50 years. And the idea that they would think of something in the 3 hours they spent writing their review that I didn't think of as a serious expert on the subject in 50 years is absurd. So, I mean, because the book came out last month in England, we've had a substantial amount of review. Most of the major reviews are already in. And we've had some great reviews, ex-poet laureate Andrew Motion wrote a lovely review of the book in The Spectator. And, most people seem to have been very positive, except for those who've got a bee in their bonnet about me personally. I think all the reviews have been good. But I don't read them. If they're bad reviews, they just annoy me. And I can't allow that. It interferes with my work. If I spend 3 days brooding about some idiot, it's 3 days I don't do my job. And if it's a good review, I go, yeah, okay, they realized it was a good book. Well, I knew that. I knew that because I spent so long working on it. The reviews, I'm saying this as a writer, not as a reader. I read reviews all the time of books I'm going to read. But as a writer, you can't allow the review to get in the way. And if it gets reviewed, that's all I care about. Give me a bad review over no review, always. It might be my worst enemy, and some of my worst enemies have indeed reviewed it. I'd rather they reviewed it because they're doing me a favor. They're doing me a favor because they're telling people it exists. And most people can read a review and know this guy's got an agenda or this woman's got an agenda, whoever. They'll know. You can tell when someone's going after somebody.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, thankfully on this subject at least, I'd hope for a little name recognition. You would have to be of a fairly cursory interest in Dylan biographically to not be aware of the stuff that I've done already. Yeah.
I do a bit of ghostwriting, and something I wrote yesterday got some very negative attention. And the person who I wrote it for, I showed it to them, and he said, "Great, it's publicity." I said, "Great."
Oh, that's exactly what happened. I can't remember if you mentioned it, but my publicist in England said that the Guardian were running a news story about another Dylan biographer had taken exception to me describing them as a professional dirt digger, and they wanted my response. The Guardian I said, I'm not going to play that game. I said, you want to run that news story, run it. I'm not going to give you a response so you can build it into a story. I don't care. Nobody cares. Nobody cares what Howard Soons thinks about me, or I care about Howard Soons. I mean, I think he's a hack. His main claim to fame is writing books about serial killers, and he's also a Dylan expert. I don't think so. But hey, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. But because that was a news story, not a review, it got picked up by the wire services. So that story got carried around the world because it goes on a wire service. So people in America the next day, Robert Hilburn, the fine LA Times writer, ex-journalist now, said, "Oh, what's this about you having an argument?" Because he's already heard about it because it's a news story.
Right.
I said to my publicist, brilliant. I said, fantastic. He's done me a huge favor. By picking a fight, he's done me a huge favor because that's a story that people who don't read book reviews will see. And they'll go, oh, there's a book.
Right. Well, I'm going to hold up the book here. Here it is, The Double Life of Bob Dylan. And this is volume 1, coming out here in the United States, May 18th. Our friends in the UK, it's already out. And what do you hope, in closing, what do you hope that people who read the book take away from it? What do you hope they get from this experience of reading?
A desire to buy volume 2.
Great answer.
I mean, I could spit it out a bit more, but yeah, the answer is I genuinely hope that they get out of it, this feeling. I want to know where the story goes. I want to know what happens.
Mm-hmm.
And if they feel that, then I've done my job. And of course, always with all of my books, if they don't listen to the music after they've read it, then I've failed.
Mm.
If it doesn't send you back to the music, then what's the point?
Well, before we go, is there anything you'd like to say to all the Bob Dylan fans around the world?
Keep reading. No, there isn't. No. But yeah, it's been fun. Good to speak again, Paul. And thanks for giving us the time. And thanks for actually reading the book as opposed to just the press release.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Clinton Heylin, thank you so much. Great honor to talk to you.
Thank you, Paul.
All right. Until next time.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll do it again. Look after yourself.
Bye-bye. Cheers.
Cheers, Paul.